Päivi has a PhD and is a docent at the Center for University Teaching and Learning, which in English I would pronounce as HYPE, at the Faculty of Educational Sciences at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And her research interests include, for example, computer science students' perceptions and expectations and evolving self-efficacy, university teachers' perceptions of online teaching, and leadership of teaching and learning in higher education. So thank you, Päivi, for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Virginia. And well, first of all, many greetings from Helsinki. It's November here, not sunny, not a bit cloudy, but a perfect day for working and attending interesting seminars. So as Virginia introduced me, I work as a senior lecturer in Helsinki University, where one of the things that I regularly do as part of my work is I give these pedagogical training courses for our staff. So you can regard me as a teacher trainer, and that is also a viewpoint that I'm going to stick with while I give my talk. But before I start with the actual presentation, I would like to thank both Virginia and Mats for inviting me for this afternoon. I was super excited to get the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions later on this afternoon. So thank you. Quite honored to be here. Today's topic is role models in computer science education. That is, of course, a very wide topic that can be approached from many different viewpoints. And I'm going to take a viewpoint of a university teacher or teacher trainer. So I will actually delimit my topic even further, and I will talk about university teachers' professional characteristics. So not all the characteristics that we as persons have, but the professional teacher characteristics that we portray in our everyday life. And I assume that many of us here today have teaching experience. So you have the first-hand experience of how many different kinds of skills and knowledge a good teacher needs to be able to do his or her work successfully. And so in our everyday life, in classrooms or in our universities, we portray many different aspects or characteristics, facets of what it is to be a teacher. So that means that our students who are observing us and interacting with us also get to observe us from many different points of view. Some students might focus on seeing or observing how good a teacher is at programming. What is that teacher's content knowledge? Another teacher, another student might be observing more how well the teacher is able to bring the best out of their students, how that particular teacher is excellent at motivating students and getting them interested in the topic. Whereas the third student might be observing how the teacher is part of a larger community, larger professional communities, and is actively participating the activities and discussions within that community and brings those discussions back to the classroom. And we as teachers, we don't always have that control over which aspects or facets, characteristics of us the students are observing and how do they interpret them. And whether they take those characteristics as a base for seeing teachers as role models, whether that be a positive or negative role model. And having that, knowing that we don't have that control over students' perceptions is just something that we need to accept, of course. However, there is another side to this story that we can affect and have control over, and that is the kind of teacher we are. So as a professional teachers, I suppose we could start to think about what kind of teachers we want to be. Well, I suppose the obvious answer would be we want to be a good teacher. So, but what is a good teacher? What kind of skills and knowledge such good teacher needs to be effective in his or her work? And how we can develop those skills further in our everyday life so that we become the best version of us as a teacher. Now, the question about what a good teacher is like is, of course, it's a difficult question. There is no one answer, and it can be a very political question, and definitely it's a subjective question. But in order to us to get further in this discussion, I decided that it might be helpful if I represent or introduce you with a framework to help with us. And this framework is called MAP, and it's an abbreviation of a multidimensional adapted process model of teaching. It's a horribly long name, so I'm just going to refer to it as a MAP framework. Well, anyway, this framework is aims at being a rather comprehensive one. It aims to portray and display different kind of knowledge and skills and practices an effective good teacher often portrays in classrooms and in teaching organizations that they are working in. This framework was originally developed in a national collaboration between all Finnish teacher training units. And it's heavily based, or it is based on a scientific literature. So it's not based on anybody's gut feeling or any individual's political point of view what a good teacher should be like. However, it is done in Finnish context, so it has probably some cultural aspects there that might not be globally agreed on, or maybe the emphasis is different in different parts of the world. But I think it provides at least a starting point for our discussion. So this framework aims to portray different characteristics of a teacher that sort of ensure or are prerequisite for a teacher to be an effective one. And by an effective teacher here is meant someone who is able to support their students so that they achieve their intended learning outcomes, they have high quality learning outcomes, a teacher who is able to support students' study motivation and well-being. So actually quite a high goals there for a teacher. So this framework aims to describe different aspects of a teacher that he or she needs if he or she wants to be an effective one or good teacher. In a way, this portrays one viewpoint of what an ideal teacher could look like. So there are three characteristics in this framework. The first one is the dimension of competencies, and it entails several subsections like teachers' knowledge base for teaching and learning, cognitive skills, social skills, and so forth. And if you read the report, each of these subsections is further divided into subsections and discussed in detail. So this figure here won't tell the whole content of the framework, but the sort of the main section headings merely. Well, in addition to the dimension of competencies, there is another characteristics, and that is the situation-specific skills. And these skills refer to the skills that can be readily observable in a classroom situation. So the teacher's competence or ability to see and observe the classroom situation and see what is now the most essential or focal, what I should be paying attention to. Making an interpretation of the situation, what is happening, why it is happening, And then finally also to make the decision in that point of time, what is the most efficient way to proceed from this particular situation. So loosely said, this could be referred also like a class management skills, but class management skills is maybe too narrow concept for this, but that's one way of thinking about situation-specific skills. The third characteristics of a highly efficient teacher is professional practices. So having those sort of practices that or ways of how the teacher interacts with a larger community, a larger professional community at different levels. So for example, how to be part of the professional community at the university level. So which committees and program directors groups you belong to, and how to be active participant in an actor in those communities. Or what kind of practices a teacher can portray when they are participating some national level or international level communities. So this is the map in short. And in this half an hour, we don't definitely have time to go through each and every one of these subsections of this map model. But instead, I decided to highlight a couple of subsections that we could maybe discuss in more detail. And I chose these subsections specifically because first, I think that the themes that they bring up relate to some of the findings and observations that Virginia has made in her work. So maybe that would give us sort of a nice background to discuss some of the students' experiences and perceptions of their teacher. Second reason for choosing these specific subsections is that at least most of them are readily observable by students, and therefore they might be something that students might regard as a base for seeing their teacher as a role model, positive or negative role model, but nevertheless the role model. But let me start with the first characteristics in more detail. So I will focus now on the dimension of competencies. And here we have two subsections, and first of them is a knowledge base for teaching and learning. Oftentimes, when we talk about teachers' knowledge base, we refer to teachers' content knowledge, or pedagogical knowledge, or pedagogical content knowledge, or even technological pedagogical content knowledge. The TPAC model is something that you might have heard about earlier. And this framework discusses about these knowledge types as well. However, for today's discussion, I wanted to highlight something else that is also portrayed in a framework, and it belongs to the knowledge base according to this framework, and that is contextual knowledge. So a good teacher, an efficient teacher, should have good contextual knowledge of in what kind of cultural context the teaching and learning that he or she is in charge of takes place in. So our courses and our teaching doesn't happen in a bubble, but we are part of a larger entity. We are a part of a large community. We are part of a society and so on. So a teacher should have that understanding and knowledge about that larger cultural context where the teaching takes place. So being aware of what kind of goals and values the larger community has suggested or posed for teaching and learning at the university or at some specific field. And this also includes the knowledge and awareness of, and perhaps some critical reflections on on what kind of, sort of political decisions have been made that might affect teaching and learning, or perhaps there are some economical factors, some bigger trends that happen in our society that might affect how the teaching and learning actually happens, and how and what we teach. And this is especially important in the sense that some of these big trends that happen around us may have an influence on the equitability of education. And if we see any sort of threats there, then we as a teacher should also have some ways to partake that discussion, that is this now the path we want to take. So when we think about teachers as a potential role models, so what does this contextual knowledge that the teacher is portraying in his or her work in a classroom or in a study program, I think it could work in two levels. Well, first of all, students might see or could observe a teacher with a contextual knowledge as someone who is welcoming them and understanding the sort of the larger entity where we are all part of, and see and take that as something to model after. Or then the other option is that while we are interacting with, when the teacher is interacting with the students and sort of perhaps, for example, discusses these contextual issues and the bigger trends in society in a classroom, it also might evoke some interest in our students to think about and be active participant in those processes themselves in some way at some point of time as well. So I think it could work in two different ways. Another competence that I want to highlight is the social skills. And oftentimes when we talk about teachers' social skills, very obvious kind of social skills are sort of come easily into mind, such as a teacher has to have a good interaction skills and emotional intelligence and so forth. And the framework acknowledges and discusses that kind of social skills as well. They are important, definitely. But for this discussion, I wanted to highlight two other kind of social skills, namely the diversity and intercultural competencies. And that refers to the teacher's sensitivity and awareness and knowledge of the multicultural context that is portrayed in our classrooms and in our study programs in our universities. Being aware of such multicultural context is one thing, then another thing is the teacher's ability to work in that context in a meaningful way and in a way that makes everybody feel welcome and something that they can take part of. It also means that the diversity and intercultural competence also means that we as teachers and program leaders and so forth are aware of well, the possibility of threat that we might be creating some structural barriers for some specific groups of students and not even noticing that. So I suppose the first thing is to be aware of that possibility and then try actively make sure that we don't create such marginalization processes or barriers for anyone. And again, I think this type of social skills can be perceived at least from two levels by our students. Well, if we truly have that diversity and intercultural competency and are able to put that into practice in a good way, then the students notice that, well, everybody has the equal opportunity and everybody's treated equally and there are no barriers for advancing for anyone. That's one thing. But then the other thing that the teacher is modeling is how to discuss about these things and how to make sure, how to be proactively making sure that there we treat everybody equally and we don't marginalize any specific groups. But that probably requires some explicit discussion, but that's something that a teacher could model explicitly too, if there's some motivation for that, shall we say that way. The third aspect that I wanted to highlight from this framework is relates to professional practices. And this refers to teachers' ways of interacting with others and being part of a larger entities or larger professional communities, either at the local level or at the international or global level. So how to be an active actor in professional communities. That's one thing that a teacher can model for students. Another way to model, or another thing to model about these professional practices, is to show and try to motivate students to be active participants themselves. So how to get into that professional community and how to act there. What are the ways you can participate in the negotiations of when the community is discussing what is the goals and values for computer science education, for example. So how to be part of that discussion and not merely someone who is then passively just taking in whatever others have decided, but how to be part of that community that has that discussion and negotiation. So now we have looked at some aspects that this MAP framework has visualized. We haven't talked about many of the specific, for example, the situation-specific skills or personal orientations or professional well-beings and cognitive skills that also might be something that our students take as a base for a modeling, base as regarding their teachers as role models. But we can leave that to the further discussions. So there are a couple of things that I want to sort of summarize. And first of all, this framework portrays one idea of an ideal teacher or effective teacher. But I'm sure that this is not the whole truth. There are many different viewpoints of what a good teacher looks like and what a good teacher needs. And I would be really interested in hearing your ideas. Do you agree with the model? And if there's something that you would like to add or remove from the model. However, the reason why I like the MAP model a lot myself is that it portrays some competencies and skills and practices that can be learned. It can be learned in many different ways, while by participating pedagogical training modules, reading some literature, reflecting what you really think, or observing and discussing with your competent teacher colleague. There are many different ways, but this model portrays some factors that we as a teachers can affect. So at least we can try to be as good teachers as we can be personally, and then what our students then decide to model or don't decide to model is then another question. But at least this is one way of thinking about that, what we as a teachers can and should be paying attention to if we want to be as good teachers as we can. So my final sort of questions for you to think about and perhaps discuss together later on is that what do you think about the MAP model? Does it portray what you think or what our community thinks are the characteristics of a good computer science teacher? What kind of characteristics a good computer science teacher should have? And here I would like to delimit the characteristics to the teacher's professional characteristics. Otherwise, the discussion just gets a bit too wide, perhaps. The second question is then so now that we have an idea of what kind of competencies and skills and practices teachers portray in their work, which of these competencies and skills you would prefer your students to take as a base for a role model? So what you would like your students to model after if you had a saying in that process. And then the third and perhaps the most provocative one is then that now that we have some sort of ideal teacher image in front of us, all of us might have a slightly different kind of image, but nevertheless, if you think about that ideal teacher image, and then what kind of teacher you are at the moment, or what kind of teacher your colleagues are at the moment, are those two images close to each other? To what degree we teachers possess those ideal competencies and skills that we would see or think that a sort of a good teacher has? And with these questions, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I really would like to, we still have 5 minutes or so open for discussion or ideas, any thoughts that my talk evoke.
Thank you so much, Päivi, and everyone is welcome to write their questions in the chat or directly raise your Zoom hand and voice your question. Päivi, maybe it would be good to have your question slide so that we can reflect on these points. Thank you.
There.
Anna, go ahead, please.
Well, I would be really interested, or I'm wondering about the professional communities. How can we understand those, and what professional communities should the students meet? And can they even copy that engagement, or should they perhaps see some other communities or other than professional? Or what are your thoughts? That's a question in my head.
So what kind of professional practices the teacher could or should model? Because I suppose that that is the most, when the teacher is interact with professional communities or ACM, whatever, or some ISRA community or so on. Those are oftentimes not so visibly or readily observable by students, because it doesn't happen in a class or in course context, but in another context. So I suppose it requires a little bit more from the teacher to bring that aspect of a teacher's work to students. Well, it could be anything between, for example, telling about or explaining, bringing some documents about what kind of discussions there are in ACM community at the moment, to, if possible, bringing some of the students to some of the conferences as a student representative and so on. So I suppose there's a large variety of things one might take, but it's definitely harder to think about the professional practices compared to how to portray some social skills or knowledge base or cognitive skills and so forth, which are more, in a way, more easy to observe without any specific extra work from the teacher.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat.
We have a comment from Ella on two concepts that Päivi raised being very helpful: a diversity competency and intercultural competency and interaction. And I definitely agree.
Mm. Yeah. And these, I have been thinking a lot about diversity and intercultural competencies, and I'm not sure how explicitly these competencies are discussed in, for example, in teacher training modules. And whether, how could we discuss those competencies in more explicit way? Because I'm sure that these are the issues that we all face in our everyday life. It's not that it's not there, but somehow we are not as used to talk about them in training sessions as let's talk about the pedagogical knowledge or pedagogical content knowledge. But then, do we have time and skills to discuss the diversity or support the diversity and intercultural competencies of our teachers? And how to support these competencies also in other contexts than not only in a formal teacher training. I mean, only few university teachers take formal teacher training courses, but there are many other ways of developing as a teacher too. So how to support that development in other less formal contexts as well. I think that is a challenge that we should talk about.
Yes, if I may do a quick comment on that before I give the word to Mats. I'm taking a teacher training course right now, and there is a model on diversity, but it's interesting for me to see how it is showing the sort of university's view on this is important, but there is of course also some resistance from people who would be seeing this map model as with that part not being maybe necessary. So it was interesting for me to see the mismatch between those two views. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Päivi. Mats, please.
Yeah, well, I think I really like this model, but I kind of wonder if you could comment a bit on, because I think it's quite useful from an individual point of view for a teacher to kind of look at this and kind of really reflect and try to do the best out of it. And then I think about this other aspect of using this as a model for teacher training. And I think those two are a bit different. Could you comment on that?
Well, maybe here one thing that might clarify why the model is like it is at the moment is that it was originally developed in a project which aim was to develop student selection in teacher training in Finland. So I think the main goal was to provide a framework to discuss in some sort of coherent way when we are selecting students to teacher training. So what are the kind of characteristics that the teacher training can help with, and what are the characteristics that the training has can affect less, or even possibly saying that what are the characteristics, maybe some personality traits that the student preferably has already before they enter the teacher training. So I think that was the original, or one of the original goals of the framework, and therefore I think it, as you said, it takes more like individual. It looks at it from the individual point of view rather than like how we should organize our teacher training models kind of way. It does provide some ideas what kind of issues we should or could include into teacher training, but it doesn't definitely tell how to teacher training should take place.
Yeah, thank you. I think sort of taking it a bit too far, like saying this is how teacher training must be, is probably not a good idea, or at least that's my gut feeling.
I think we need another model after that, map models, some sort of a process type model.
Quite a nice model, though. Yeah, I like it.
I agree. Thank you so much, Mats, and thank you so much, Päivi, for this presentation. We have to stop here, but we can maybe continue the discussion as part of the panel later. And so now we take a little break, and we're back at 15 past, which might be 1, 2, or 3, depending on your time zone. But we'll see you at 15 past.